My name is Claire Dawson. I'm 31 years old, an architect living in Denver, and for most of my life, I believed that reason and fairness could hold a family together. I thought if you built something carefully, conversation by conversation, gesture by gesture, it couldn't be undone by a few words. I was wrong. It took one story from my father to erase years of effort, and by the time I realized how deep the damage ran, my family had already decided who I was without asking me. If you're watching this, please like the video, share your own experiences in the comments, and subscribe to the channel. Stories like these remind people that silence isn't the same as peace. It began quietly, the way betrayal usually does. My father had always been the kind of man who spoke with certainty, whose voice filled a room and left no space for doubt. People trusted him because he looked like the kind of person you were supposed to trust. Calm, articulate, always with a reason for everything. I grew up believing that logic was his compass. But that winter, logic turned into weaponry. He told my family something that changed everything. I still don't know exactly how he phrased it, only that it spread fast. A story about money from one of my architectural projects, about ethical boundaries, about choices that made me look selfish. It didn't matter that none of it was true. What mattered was that it sounded like something they could believe. And because it came from him, they did. The first sign came from my mother, who stopped answering my messages. Then my brother, who canceled plans without explanation. My aunt's tone cooled in our usual phone calls, and eventually, even my cousins began to drift. I was left with the echo of my father's version of me, a version that existed only in his words but somehow felt more real to everyone than the person I actually was. The weeks that followed felt like walking through a fog that kept thickening. I kept hoping someone would reach out, ask for my side, but the silence said more than any accusation could. When I finally learned what had been said, it was already too late. The words had done their work. My parents believed his story, and the rest of the family followed like a tide. December crept closer, and with it came the usual messages about holiday plans. But this year, none arrived. The family group chat that had once been a thread of recipes and inside jokes had gone quiet for me. I saw my brother posting photos with captions about family traditions and keeping things simple this year. I wasn't part of the simplicity. That was when I realized that my father's story hadn't just changed how they saw me. It had rewritten where I belonged. I had been edited out. And yet, somewhere in that emptiness, a thought began to form. If my father could rewrite my story once, maybe I could write it back myself, on my own terms, in my own space. Christmas would no longer be the season they took from me. It would be the moment I took back. After the story spread, the silence became its own kind of language. My phone stayed quiet in ways it never had before. The group chat that once pulsed with family noise, the constant stream of dinner photos, sarcastic comments, and half-remembered jokes, turned still. The emptiness wasn't sudden. It built like snow layering itself until the world outside looks untouched but isn't. Every unanswered message, every delayed response, every conversation that ended before it started carried the same message. We believe him. I kept trying to reason through it. I thought if I stayed calm, if I reached out with kindness, the misunderstanding would unravel. I sent my mother a long email explaining that the project my father mentioned had already been cleared by my firm's ethics board. No reply came. Not even the curt acknowledgement she usually sent when she wanted to keep things polite. My brother unfollowed me online, something small and digital but somehow enormous. My aunt, who had always been the family's soft heart, left my last voicemail unreturned. It was like watching the scaffolding of my life quietly dismantle itself while I stood inside it. What stung most wasn't the isolation, it was the familiarity of it. My father had always known how to control the air in a room. When I was younger, he would decide which version of me existed on any given day. The overachiever who needed humbling, The quiet disappointment who needed fixing, the ungrateful daughter who needed to learn her place. Now he was doing it again, but at scale, constructing a narrative big enough for an entire family to inhabit. The holidays approached like an uninvited reminder. Every store window glittered with decorations. Every song on the radio spoke about homecomings and reunions. I walked through them like a ghost, surrounded by other people's warmth. I tried to picture what Christmas would look like this year and kept coming back to the same image. My parents' living room glowing with firelight, laughter rising from the same people who now looked past me, the chair where I used to sit quietly empty. There was a time when I would have shown up anyway, pretending that the cold glances didn't burn, hoping that effort could fill the gaps that love didn't. But something had shifted. Maybe it was age, maybe exhaustion, or maybe the quiet realization that if people could erase you so easily, it was because they'd already practiced. I stopped calling. I stopped explaining. The silence they built became a mirror I no longer wanted to stand in front of. For weeks, I went through the motions of my life like someone rehearsing a part they didn't want anymore. I went to work, signed contracts, smiled at clients. I kept my posture straight, my tone professional, my grief contained. But beneath it all was a low hum of defiance I couldn't quite silence. It said that if I couldn't be part of their story anymore, maybe it was time to start my own. The first spark came one evening as I scrolled through photos of mountain lodges for a potential client. I stopped at one image, a long wooden house with windows spilling gold into the snow, and realized I recognized the architecture. It was mine. A project I had designed years ago for an investor who later sold it. I remembered the exact ridge it stood on, the way the light hit it at dusk. I also remembered that I had bought it quietly a few months earlier as a long-term investment property. It was still there, waiting, standing against the cold. The idea started small, a few days away, alone, somewhere quiet. But the more I thought about it, the more it grew. I didn't want to escape Christmas. I wanted to reclaim it. If my father's story had turned the family against me, maybe I could write another one that wasn't built on lies, but on presence. I began to picture it. The lodge lit up against the snow, laughter rising from rooms that hadn't heard mine in years, the kind of warmth that couldn't be faked. A gathering not born of obligation, but of choice. For the first time in months, the thought of December didn't feel like a punishment. It felt like a plan. The lodge had been waiting for me long before I knew I would need it. I bought it 2 years ago after completing one of my firm's biggest contracts, a luxury ski resort renovation that had drained me completely. Back then, the purchase had felt indulgent, almost guilty, like a monument to exhaustion. It was supposed to be my retreat, a place to breathe after the long days and longer silences that defined my life in Denver. I never thought it would become something else entirely, a declaration, a line drawn in snow and stone. When I first visited again that December, Aspen was already deep in winter. The road climbed in quiet spirals, each turn unveiling more of the landscape. Pine forests heavy with snow, ridges touched by pale gold sunlight. I kept my phone face down on the passenger seat. It vibrated every few minutes, not from messages of concern but from work emails and holiday promotions. My family's silence, as usual, was louder than anything else. The lodge appeared slowly between the trees, its dark timber frame rising from the white. Even after all this time, it still caught me off guard. There was a kind of authority to it, not ostentatious, but solid, unshakable. The appraiser had valued it at just over $5 million, though no number could really measure what it meant to me now. Inside, the air was cold and clean, scented faintly with cedar. The rooms stood empty, waiting, but there was something in that emptiness that felt like potential instead of loneliness. I walked through the great room, boots echoing softly on the wood floor, and imagined what it could look like in 2 weeks. The space was large enough to hold 20 people easily, the windows wide enough to swallow the horizon. I pictured garlands woven along the beams, a tree tall enough to touch the ceiling, the fire catching and holding everyone's faces in amber light. For a moment, I felt something close to peace, not because I was healing, but because I was finally building. That night, I made a list. Not a wish list or a dream board, a blueprint. Flights, accommodations, decorations, menu, music. Every line was measured, deliberate. I'd spent my entire career designing spaces that made people feel something. Now I was designing a feeling for myself. The difference was that this one didn't need anyone's approval. I decided I wouldn't announce anything publicly. The power would come from the surprise, from the quiet shift of gravity when my family realized the holiday had revolved without them. But revenge wasn't the only goal. Somewhere under the layers of anger was a softer truth. I wanted to create a Christmas that meant belonging, even if it didn't include the people who had once defined the word for me. The next morning, I met with a small team in Aspen, a florist, a catering manager, and a local decorator who had worked on luxury lodges across the valley. I spoke with the calm precision that had always impressed my clients, outlining exactly what I wanted. The garlands would be fresh pine mixed with eucalyptus, soft enough to carry scent but not overwhelm. The dining room would be set with antique brass and white linen. The trees, there would be two, had to feel alive, imperfect, wild, as though the forest itself had stepped inside. Every choice mattered because every detail would be a translation of something I'd never been able to say aloud. In between meetings, I wandered through the empty rooms again, noting where the light hit the floor at different hours. By afternoon, I found myself standing by the window looking out over the valley as the sun began to fade. For years, I'd been the quiet observer of other people's holidays, the extra chair no one remembered to fill. Now I was the architect of a new one. That realization was almost frightening. Freedom often is. It comes with the weight of responsibility, not just to prove something, but to make it real. I wasn't creating this to impress anyone. I was building it so I could finally see myself reflected somewhere other than in my father's stories. As the first snowflakes began to fall again, I turned off the lights and stood in the doorway for a moment before leaving. The lodge looked peaceful, almost asleep, but I could already see what it would become. A place that shimmered with warmth, laughter, and the quiet satisfaction of finally stepping out of someone else's shadow. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was running from something. I felt like I was walking toward it. New Year's Eve arrived wrapped in that strange electricity that only New York could produce. Part frost, part fever, part promise. From my apartment window, the skyline shimmered like something breathing. Somewhere beyond those towers was the penthouse I had paid for, the place my parents now called their own, the one I had been uninvited from. All day, I had moved through silence. Every action felt ritualistic: shower, coffee, the careful choice of a dress, the way I pinned my hair. There was something almost ceremonial in the preparation. I wasn't getting ready for revenge. I was getting ready to stop pretending I was powerless. Outside, the city hummed with anticipation. Streets overflowed with people chasing midnight, glitter pressed against skin, laughter bouncing off the frozen air. Inside my apartment, it was still. I had lit a candle earlier, not for celebration, but for focus, and its flame swayed gently beside the mirror where I stood. My reflection looked unfamiliar, sharper somehow. The same face that had smiled politely through every family slight now stared back at me with quiet steadiness. There was no bitterness left, only clarity. The dress I wore was black, not mournful, but deliberate. It was simple, structured, strong. Around my neck, a small diamond pendant caught the candlelight, one of the few things in my life that had been given without condition. As I looked out over the city, I thought of all the years I had spent waiting for invitations that never came, believing exclusion was something I had to earn my way out of. That part of me was gone now. I was done waiting. When the car arrived, I descended the stairs without hesitation. The streets flashed with light and sound, horns, cheers, the metallic scent of snow in the air. As the driver crossed the bridge, I watched the skyline shift, the buildings growing taller, brighter, more certain of themselves. Somewhere in that glittering maze, my parents were hosting their version of perfection, and I was about to walk into it. Madison Tower was exactly as I had designed it to be, understated and magnificent, a statement that whispered instead of shouted. The doorman recognized me instantly, his expression caught between surprise and deference. He greeted me by name, the way one greets an owner, not a guest. That alone steadied me more than I expected. Inside, the lobby glowed under the chandelier I had chosen 3 years earlier, its light scattered across the marble floor in soft fragments, like pieces of a memory. I paused for a moment beneath it, letting the air settle around me. This was mine. Every line, every detail, every inch of this building had once passed through my hands. I had given it life, and they had claimed it as theirs. In the elevator, the mirrored walls surrounded me from every angle. I watched myself breathe, calm, unhurried, resolute. The hum of the machinery was a low, steady rhythm under my ribs. When the doors opened on the 57th floor, the sound of the party rolled in like heat. Music drifted through the corridor, soft jazz layered with laughter and the murmur of expensive conversation. The hallway leading to the penthouse was lined with orchids and candles, all my mother's choices, but on the foundation I had built. The irony was almost poetic. I had created this place to hold light, and now it was holding truth instead. At the entrance, attendants checked names against a list. I watched as one of them frowned at his clipboard, clearly confused when mine wasn't there. His eyes flicked from the list to my face, then to the ID I handed him. The shift in his expression said everything. Recognition, respect, realization. Without a word, he stepped aside and opened the door. The sound hit first. Laughter echoing off glass, music rising, champagne fizzing. The scent of perfume and polished silver filled the air. I stepped forward slowly, my heels soundless against the marble. It didn't take long for people to notice me. The ripple of awareness spread quietly at first. Glances over shoulders, whispers just above the music. My mother stood near the bar, her expression freezing for a fraction of a second when she saw me. My father, across the room, turned with that practiced smile he used when control slipped from his hands. For a moment, the entire scene looked like a painting, perfect, motionless, brittle. I could feel the weight of their discomfort pressing against the air, heavy and fragile all at once. But I didn't look away. I walked deeper into the room, every step slow and deliberate. I didn't raise my voice, didn't explain myself, didn't apologize. I didn't need to. My presence alone was the conversation. The city glittered beyond the windows, endless and alive. Somewhere out there, fireworks rehearsed for midnight. Inside, silence crept like a tide between the notes of the music, growing stronger with every second. I stood beneath the chandelier, the one that had cost me months of design revisions, and let its light pour down my shoulders. I wasn't crashing their party. I was reclaiming my space. And for the first time in years, they were the ones who didn't know where to stand. The silence inside the penthouse unfolded slowly, like fabric being torn in reverse. It began at the edges, quiet glances, half-finished sentences, hands tightening around champagne glasses, before it reached the center of the room. I could feel it spread, subtle but unstoppable, a shift in temperature that everyone sensed, but no one dared name. The music tried to hold its ground, but even the band seemed unsure. The pianist's hands hesitated, the rhythm faltering for half a beat before recovering. Laughter dulled into a thin hum. I moved through the crowd without rush, each step steady, every breath deliberate. Years of learned restraint had trained me for this kind of silence, the kind that follows a storm no one expected to happen indoors. My mother was the first to move. She approached me with that controlled grace she'd perfected over decades, the kind that could make discomfort look like poise. Her face carried the same expression she used at charity events: polite, luminous, and utterly unreadable. She said something I couldn't hear over the music, but her eyes told me everything: surprise, irritation, and beneath it, fear. Not fear of me, but of what I represented. The reminder that truth doesn't ask for permission to arrive. I didn't answer her. I only smiled faintly, the kind of smile that doesn't invite conversation. My father noticed me moments later. His expression broke faster than hers. The mask slipped just for a second, revealing confusion and the smallest trace of guilt before he composed himself again. He spoke to a group near him, perhaps to explain, perhaps to distract. But the people around him had already begun to look past him, toward me. I realized, standing there beneath the light of my own chandelier, that I no longer felt like an intruder. Every inch of that room bore the fingerprints of my design: the curves of the railing, the marble pattern on the floor, the way the evening light touched the glass. It was my work, my vision, my home. And yet, they had convinced themselves it belonged entirely to them. I walked deeper into the party. The crowd parted in small ripples, making space without quite realizing why. I could hear my name whispered at the edges of the room, each repetition changing in tone: curiosity, disbelief, fascination. No one seemed to know whether to greet me or avoid me, so they did both at once. My mother followed, trying to maintain composure. Her movements were careful, every gesture choreographed to suggest calm. But her eyes betrayed her, darting from one guest to another, silently begging them to pretend everything was fine. My father stayed near the piano, stiff and unmoving, pretending to be absorbed in conversation. He had always preferred silence over confrontation. Control, for him, was best expressed through distance. I could sense the question forming in everyone's mind. Why was she here? I wanted to tell them that I had no plan for drama, no intention of creating spectacle. I was simply tired of being absent from my own story. I had been removed, rewritten, omitted, and this was me, reclaiming authorship. A photographer, unaware of the tension, tried to capture the moment. My mother noticed and shut it down instantly, her polite tone masking panic. That single act drew more attention than the photo would have. The room stilled again. The music thinned, reduced to a hum beneath the sound of people pretending not to stare. I stood near the center now, surrounded by beauty and emptiness in equal measure. My father eventually crossed the room toward me, his steps sharp but hesitant. He leaned in just enough for me to sense what he wanted to say: that I shouldn't be there, that I was disrupting something delicate. But I didn't need to hear the words. I had lived them my entire life. I met his gaze briefly, then turned toward the balcony. The air outside was cold and honest, the kind of cold that cleanses. The city stretched below, endless lights, distant music, the pulse of fireworks rehearsing in the sky. Behind me, I could feel the discomfort of the room growing heavier, a tension so thick it could be measured in heartbeats. Standing at the edge of the balcony, I let the sound of the city swallow the noise behind me. The laughter, the whispers, the performance. It all faded into insignificance. I wasn't angry. I wasn't vindictive. I was free. Inside, my mother's attempts at damage control continued, her laughter forced, her charm cracking at the seams. My father avoided eye contact, pretending to be engaged with someone else. And around them, the guests began to understand the truth in fragments. The penthouse wasn't theirs. The power wasn't theirs. And the woman they had quietly erased had just rewritten the evening without saying a word. I stayed by the window for a while, watching the reflections in the glass. My figure framed against the skyline, their silhouettes shrinking behind me. I thought about the years I'd spent trying to earn belonging in that family, the countless moments where silence had been mistaken for acceptance. Tonight, that silence had finally broken. I turned slightly, enough to catch my mother's reflection across the room. She was still smiling, but the tension in her jaw betrayed her. I realized then that she wasn't angry because I had come. She was angry because I hadn't asked for permission. As the fireworks began to bloom over the city, I lifted my glass one last time, not to them, but to the version of myself who had once waited by the phone for their approval. She was gone now, and in her place stood someone uninvited and entirely unafraid. The energy in the room shifted after that. The music had returned, but it no longer belonged to the celebration. It felt like a cover, a thin layer of noise stretched over something uneasy. Laughter came in short bursts, too loud, too quick, and then vanished again into awkward silences. I could feel the tension pulsing behind every smile, that collective awareness that something unspoken had settled over the night, altering its shape. I stayed near the balcony, half in the cold, half in the light. The city below shimmered, alive and endless, unaware that somewhere above its chaos, a family was quietly unraveling. The sound of fireworks testing in the distance reached me first, muffled, promising. Inside, people raised their glasses as though nothing had changed, but their glances betrayed them. Some avoided my eyes entirely. Others looked at me with curiosity that bordered on admiration. They didn't know the full story, but they knew enough to sense that truth had walked into the room and refused to leave. My parents were the only ones still pretending. My mother floated between groups, her gestures too polished, her laughter slightly delayed. She was trying to hold the narrative together, the way she always had. My father, on the other hand, stayed near the bar, posture rigid, his silence sharp enough to draw blood. I knew that silence well. It was the same one that had filled our house for years whenever something didn't fit his idea of control. At one point, my mother passed close enough for me to sense her perfume, that same floral scent she'd worn since I was a child. She didn't look directly at me, but her body tightened as she walked by, as if my presence were gravity she had to resist. I understood her message without words. Leave quietly, don't ruin this. But I didn't move. I didn't need to. Simply standing there was already enough to shift everything they thought they owned. As the evening slipped closer to midnight, the crowd began to gather near the panoramic windows. Someone dimmed the lights, and the city outside flared brighter, its skyline a tapestry of gold and glass. The countdown clock appeared on one of the screens, glowing red. 10 minutes to midnight. The chatter swelled again, desperate to sound natural. People exchanged toasts, kisses, resolutions they wouldn't keep. I stood by the glass, watching my reflection merge with the skyline. It was strange to see myself surrounded by what I had created. This life, this success, this independence, and realize how often I had let others define it for me. I wasn't there to prove a point. I was there to remember who I was before their approval became a currency. Behind me, my father began speaking to someone, his voice measured but tight. He was explaining something, justifying, rewriting. I didn't turn to look. I knew that tone too well. It was the sound of damage control, the way he had always tried to rebuild image before facing truth. When I finally caught his reflection in the glass, I noticed that he was watching me between sentences, not speaking, not blinking, just observing. It wasn't anger I saw there. It was something quieter, something almost like fear. Not of me, but of what my presence revealed about him. The minutes bled into each other until the clock hit its final stretch. Someone called for the lights to be lowered again. The city outside seemed to hold its breath. The crowd began counting together, the numbers climbing over one another. 10, 9, 8. Their voices echoing through the glass like a single heartbeat. I didn't join them. Instead, I looked past my reflection and into the city. I thought of every New Year's Eve I had spent waiting for an invitation, for validation, for some acknowledgement that I belonged. I thought of the girl I had been, polite, patient, endlessly hopeful. That version of me had waited at the edges of rooms for years, smiling through the ache of invisibility. I realized then that she wasn't gone. She had simply been waiting for me to come back and stand beside her, As the count reached 3, I closed my eyes. The noise around me dissolved into the pulse of my own heartbeat. 2. The air smelled of champagne and winter. 1. The world erupted in light. The fireworks exploded across the sky, streaks of gold, silver, and crimson blooming like promises kept too late. Glasses clinked, laughter erupted again, and the city roared in approval of itself. I stood still, feeling the vibration of celebration wash through the windows and into my bones. It was a new year. But more than that, it was the first year that belonged entirely to me. I left before the noise faded. I slipped out through the corridor, the sound of my heels echoing against the marble I had chosen. No one stopped me. No one dared. The elevator doors closed softly, sealing the party above me like a memory already fading. As I descended, the city unfolded below, alive, infinite, unbothered. Midnight had come and gone, and for once, I didn't need to wish for anything. I already had what I'd been chasing all along, the quiet, unshakable certainty that I no longer owed anyone permission to exist. Morning light came with a kind of gentleness that New York rarely allowed. It slipped through the glass, pale and forgiving, painting the buildings in soft gold. I had slept little, but I wasn't tired. The exhaustion that came after confrontation was gone, replaced by something lighter, not triumph, but release. I hadn't gone home after leaving the Penthouse. I had booked a hotel room in Midtown instead, a habit I'd learned years ago. Always have a place to retreat to when silence feels earned. The elevator ride up had been quiet, the lobby empty except for a few people still wearing the glitter of last night. The world was moving on already. Only I remained suspended between endings and beginnings. When I woke, the room was filled with that particular stillness that follows resolution, the kind that doesn't need applause to feel final. I made coffee, stood by the window, and watched the city shift back into motion. Taxis resumed their choreography, steam rose from manholes, and the sidewalks glittered faintly with confetti washed into slush. It was the first morning of the new year, and for once, I didn't feel behind. My phone lay face down on the nightstand, silent but heavy with what I hadn't yet read. I knew it was waiting. The messages, the missed calls, the digital residue of the night before. I picked it up only when the quiet began to feel too fragile. Dozens of notifications filled the screen. My parents' names were at the top, followed by numbers I didn't recognize and a few cousins whose curiosity had clearly outweighed their discretion. I didn't open everything. I skimmed just enough to understand the pattern. Shock, anger, guilt, defense. Some messages tried to shame me, others tried to reason. None surprised me. There were also messages from relatives who had never taken sides before. Short, hesitant notes that said things like, "You did the right thing, and I wish I had your strength." Those I read twice. Not because I needed validation, but because they reminded me how many people had been quiet witnesses for years, watching the same story unfold but never finding a way to name it. The news had already caught fragments of what had happened. A headline scrolled across a morning news ticker, vague but unmistakable. Heiress makes dramatic appearance at parents' penthouse party. The photo showed the skyline at midnight, the fireworks glowing over Madison Tower. There was no mention of names, but it didn't need one. The silence that followed that story would be louder than the story itself. I turned the television off and stood by the window again. The reflection in the glass didn't look like the woman who had spent her life negotiating her worth. The face staring back was calmer, grounded. It wasn't a new version of me. It was the one that had always been there, buried beneath years of trying to earn love that had been conditional from the beginning. As I stood there, I thought of my mother's expression the night before, the way her control cracked for just a second when she realized she couldn't stop the truth from being seen. I thought of my father's silence, the weight of his disappointment pressed into every glance he didn't give me. It should have hurt. Once, it would have. But that morning, I only felt distance. Not the cold kind, but the kind that brings clarity. Eventually, I opened one message from my mother. It was long, carefully written, full of the same justifications that had filled my childhood. She spoke about appearances, about family, about how I could have handled things differently. Near the end, there was one sentence that stood out. "You made a fool of us in front of everyone." I read it twice, then set the phone down. What she didn't understand, what she had never understood, was that I hadn't set out to embarrass anyone. I had only stopped participating in the version of the story where I was the problem. The hours passed slowly, the sunlight shifting from gold to silver as the day aged. I stayed by the window, letting the sounds of the city blend into a kind of low, constant hum. It felt like background music for a life I was finally ready to inhabit on my own terms. I didn't reply to my mother's message. I didn't call my father. For the first time, there was no urge to explain, no need to be understood. Some silences aren't empty. They're earned. As evening fell, the city lights came on one by one, steady and endless. Somewhere in the distance, Madison Tower stood tall, its windows reflecting a sky I no longer looked toward for approval. I took a slow breath, feeling the weight of years lift with it. The new year had begun quietly. Not with fireworks, not with apologies, but with peace. And for me, that was louder than any celebration could ever be. The following day arrived gray and brittle, the kind of cold that made even sound move slower. The city had already returned to its rhythm. Taxis splashing through dirty snow, strangers walking with coffee cups pressed to their mouths, holiday decorations beginning to look like relics of a celebration already forgotten. I dressed without hurry, layering calm over the nerves that hummed somewhere deep beneath the surface. My mother's note sat on the table, folded and precise. It was short, but I could still hear her tone in every word, a tone that disguised command as civility. We were to meet for lunch at a small French restaurant on Madison Avenue. It was a place I had once taken her to for her birthday years earlier, before things between us had frozen into a kind of polite estrangement. It was exactly the kind of setting she preferred for difficult conversations. Expensive enough to ensure composure, intimate enough to maintain control. When I arrived, she was already there, seated by the window. Her posture was perfect, as always, hands resting on the table like still life art. Everything about her seemed curated, from the pale cashmere coat draped over the chair to the faint pearls at her neck. Her wine glass remained untouched, its surface catching the dim light like a held breath. She looked up as I entered, her expression soft in a way that almost fooled me. For a second, I wondered if she believed that pretending nothing had broken would somehow repair it. I greeted her calmly and sat down across from her. The air smelled faintly of butter and cold metal. The restaurant was quiet, with the kind of refined silence that money buys. She began to speak almost immediately, her voice measured, her sentences wrapped in the language of reason. She mentioned how surprised everyone had been by my arrival, how the night had taken a turn, how she wished things had gone differently. She didn't say, "You embarrassed us," but the meaning clung to every word. I let her speak for a while. Years of experience had taught me that interruptions were wasted on her. She had always needed to complete her performance before hearing anyone else's truth. As she talked, I studied her face, the subtle tension around her eyes, the way her mouth trembled slightly each time she sipped her water. Beneath the polish, there was unease. It wasn't remorse. It was fear. When she finally paused, I told her, as evenly as I could, that I had only gone to the Penthouse because I wanted to stand inside something that was already mine. I said it without accusation, only clarity. She looked startled, as if she hadn't expected calmness from me. Perhaps she'd been prepared for anger, something she could dismiss as emotional. Calm was harder to argue with. She insisted that I had misunderstood everything, that the exclusion hadn't been intentional. that it had been a smaller gathering, just close friends. Her words were familiar, the same script she had used throughout my life to justify every omission. I remembered birthdays they'd forgotten to call about, dinners I'd learned about through relatives, the way they had stopped saying, "We missed you," and started saying, "We assumed you were busy." Every excuse came dressed as kindness, but it was still absence underneath. I told her that I no longer mistook distance for misunderstanding, that what had happened wasn't an accident. It was a habit. She blinked at that, the movement small but sharp, like something hitting glass. For a while, neither of us spoke. The waiter came and went silently, refilling water we didn't drink. Outside, snow began to fall in slow spirals, blurring the edges of the world beyond the window. I watched it and thought about how something as gentle as snow could still bury things completely if given enough time. My mother broke the silence again, this time with a voice that sounded tired rather than polished. She said that my father had been hurt, that he hadn't expected such a scene, that people were talking. I knew she cared more about the talking than the hurt. It was always reputation first, emotion second. I didn't respond right away. I simply let her words drift between us, unanchored. Eventually, I told her that what had happened at the Penthouse hadn't been about humiliation. It had been about truth. For years, I had been invisible in rooms full of people who used my name when it benefited them and forgot it when it didn't. That night, I had simply stopped disappearing. She said nothing after that. Her hand rested near her glass, unmoving, as if she were afraid that motion would make the silence heavier. The moment stretched long enough for me to feel something unexpected. Not anger, not satisfaction, but pity. Because I finally understood that she would never change. Not out of cruelty, but because she didn't know how to live without control. When the bill arrived, she reached for it automatically, the same reflex she had always had when she wanted to prove she was still in charge. I placed my card on top of hers, gently but firmly. She didn't argue. As I stood to leave, the reflection in the window showed us both, her composed but hollow, me steady and unafraid. I didn't look back as I walked out into the cold. The city was still gray, but the air felt cleaner. That conversation hadn't been closure. It had been confirmation. The final proof that I no longer needed her understanding to move on. And as I stepped into the falling snow, I realized that the silence between us wasn't punishment. It was peace. The days that followed passed quietly, as if the city itself had exhaled. Snow gathered on window ledges, traffic softened, and even the constant noise of New York seemed dimmed beneath the blanket of cold. I stayed in the hotel for 2 more nights, not because I needed the distance, but because I liked the stillness. It was strange how peace could feel so foreign at first, like a new language learned late. The conversation with my mother replayed in my mind in fragments, not as words, but as sensations. The chill in her tone when she tried to rewrite history, the quiet when she realized I wouldn't play along, the final understanding that passed between us when I stood to leave. I hadn't won anything. There was no victory in that meeting, only truth, and truth was enough. On the morning of the 3rd day, I finally returned to my apartment. The city had thawed a little, and the air smelled faintly of salt and exhaust. My doorman greeted me with the cautious kindness people reserve for those who have recently been in the news. I knew what he had seen. Headlines written in careful neutrality, gossip dressed as journalism. The story had traveled faster than I expected. Online, the details had taken on their own life. There were articles with vague titles like "Heiress Draws Line Between Family and Fortune" and anonymous posts that speculated endlessly about what had really happened that night. Some people painted me as reckless, others as brave. I read none of it fully. The truth was mine, and no one could tell it better or worse than I already had. My phone continued to buzz. Messages from relatives arrived like ripples, each one different in tone. Some were curious, some sympathetic, others laced with cautious admiration. A few were colder, written by those who felt loyalty to my parents was safer than honesty. It didn't matter. For once, I didn't feel the urge to respond, to defend myself, to fix anything. Let them decide what version they wanted to believe. My mother hadn't written again since the lunch. My father hadn't written at all. I imagined their silence not as absence but as retreat. They were probably waiting for the noise to fade, hoping that the world would move on to its next fascination. It would. But I knew what they didn't. That silence doesn't erase, it only echoes in new ways. The only message I answered came from my cousin, a simple note that said he was proud of me, followed by a line that read, "It's strange how truth changes the shape of a family." He was right. Even without confrontation, everything had shifted. The fragile hierarchy my parents had built for years, the unspoken rules that decided who belonged and who didn't, had cracked open. They had built their influence on perception. I had changed it by simply showing up. I spent that evening by the window, watching the lights turn on across the skyline. Somewhere out there, the penthouse gleamed against the dark, its windows golden, its rooms undoubtedly quiet. I imagined my parents moving through it in silence, surrounded by all the beauty they'd borrowed but unable to escape the shadow of the truth now attached to it. That place would never feel untouched again. Every chandelier, every marble tile, every reflection would carry a faint trace of the moment I walked through their illusion and made it transparent. For the first time, I didn't feel anger toward them. What I felt was distance, clean, final, necessary. I no longer wanted an apology or an explanation. I had spent years hoping they would one day see me for who I was. Now I realized they already had. They had seen me, understood my strength, and decided it was easier to diminish it than to face it. That realization no longer hurt. It simply clarified the truth. I was never invisible. I was inconvenient. That night, I cooked for myself. Something simple. Pasta, wine, quiet music. I ate by the window, the lights of the city reflecting across the glass. The life I had built, the independence I had fought for, the peace I was finally learning to keep. It all felt earned in a way that no celebration could match. As I washed the dishes, I thought about how stories like mine often end with reconciliation, with soft apologies and slow forgiveness. But real healing rarely looks like that. Sometimes it looks like sitting alone in a warm apartment, hearing only the sound of your own breath and realizing you're okay. Outside, snow began to fall again, thin and aimless, drifting through the glow of streetlights. I stood there watching it for a long time, and for once, there was no ache in remembering, no fear of what would come next. The story had turned. The silence was mine now, and it finally sounded like peace. January felt like the exhale after a storm. The fireworks had burned out, the parties had ended, and the city had gone back to pretending it didn't remember what it had celebrated. I liked that quiet honesty. It mirrored the way my life felt now. Empty in places, yes, but finally mine. The week after New Year's Eve drifted by in slow motion. I kept my phone face down on the counter, the notifications unread. The silence didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt earned. For years, I had lived waiting for approval that never came, apologizing for wanting to belong. But that night, in the penthouse I had once bought for them, I finally understood. Belonging is not given by others. It's reclaimed by self-respect. I started walking every morning along the East River, wrapped in a scarf, and thought. The cold air bit my cheeks, but it woke me in ways comfort never had. I watched the city's reflection ripple on the water, thinking about all the versions of myself I had tried to be. The peacemaker, the dutiful daughter, the invisible guest. None of them had survived that night, and that was the point. The family fallout unfolded quietly, just like everything else they'd ever done. Some relatives reached out with sympathy, others stayed loyal to my parents' silence. My aunt sent a brief message. "You did what we all wished we could have done." I didn't reply. Not because I didn't appreciate it, but because I didn't need it. Validation had stopped being a currency in my life. Inside my apartment, the air felt lighter. I opened the curtains wider, let the city light spill across the floor, and played soft jazz through the speakers. The space that had once felt temporary now felt permanent, not because it was perfect, but because it was real. There were no ghosts here, only peace. One night I sat by the window, candle flickering beside me, and thought about the penthouse again. Not the confrontation, not the humiliation, but the silence that followed it. The kind of silence that breaks chains instead of hearts. For so long I had mistaken quiet for emptiness. Now I understood it was freedom. I realized then that this wasn't revenge anymore. Revenge is about proving someone wrong. What I had done was simply prove myself right. To myself. I hadn't walked into that party to hurt them. I had walked in to reclaim the space they took from me. And in doing that, I had stepped out of their story entirely. As the candle burned lower, I whispered a silent goodbye. Not to my parents, but to the version of me who had waited her whole life for them to see her. She deserved rest. She finally had it. When the flame finally went out, the room didn't go dark. The city lights were still there, endless, bright, alive. And for the first time, I didn't need anyone to notice me shining. If this story reached you, like and subscribe. Tell me in the comments. Have you ever realized that walking away was the most powerful thing you could do?